Robert Charles Comer, 50, was the first inmate executed in Arizona since November 2000. He was a death row inmate who did not ask for clemency. He did not beg for forgiveness. On the contrary, he demanded to die, publicly, fiercely, and defiantly. What makes a cold-blooded killer who had spread absolute terror give up every chance to live, even smiling chillingly upon hearing his death sentence? This story is not merely about an execution being carried out. It is a journey into the mind of a demon, a life that began in neglect and ended with a choice that shocked everyone. This is the story of a terrifying night in the Arizona desert, where an innocent man was brutally murdered, and a couple endured hell on earth at the hands of a predator. Today, we will revisit the entire shocking case file of Robert Charles Comer. From a childhood buried in darkness and uncontrollable escalation of crime to the final meals and defiant last words just before his execution. This is the story of the killer who did not want to be saved. Due to the extremely serious nature and violent details of the case, viewer discretion is advised. On October 3, 1987, in the Lake Apache area, Arizona. This place was a peaceful paradise for camping enthusiasts, a retreat to escape the noise of urban life. The lake's surface was calm, surrounded by silent mountain ranges, the atmosphere so still one could hear the wind whistling through the cactus bushes. But on that fateful day, the peace was shattered by a savage crime. The victim was Larry Pritchard, a 40-year-old man who had come here to camp alone, seeking the tranquility of nature. He had no idea that in the desert's darkness, a predator was watching. That predator was Robert Charles Comer. He approached Larry unexpectedly without a word of warning. The attack was swift and brutal. Comer shot Larry dead at his campsite. After taking the victim's life, he coldly stole his belongings and fled in the very car of the man he had just murdered. Comer's crimes did not stop there. While fleeing the murder scene, his brutal instincts continued to surge. He encountered a young couple on the road. With a gun in his hand, Comer forced them to obey his every command. He took them hostage, forcing them to travel with him in absolute terror. During that horrifying time, the woman was brutally raped by Comer. The couple faced death at every moment, living under constant threat. But by some miracle, they survived. Their survival was not just extraordinary luck. It became the key to bringing Robert Comer to justice. They were the living witnesses who would recount the entire horrific story and become the undeniable evidence to convict him. Why did Comer choose a secluded place like Lake Apache? Was this a completely random attack, or was there a deeper reason hidden in his twisted mind? This detail will become important when we analyze his psychology later in the story. Another question also arises after committing murder. Why didn't Comer eliminate the couple to cover his tracks? Let's speculate and leave a comment below. Did he have another intention, or was it simply that luck smiled upon these two victims? To understand the brutal actions of Robert Charles Comer, we must look at the life of the victim, Larry Pritchard. At opposite ends of this story are two completely contrasting lives. Larry Pritchard, a 40-year-old man, was living a completely normal life. He likely had a steady job, a family, and his own hobbies. The solo camping trip to Lake Apache was probably his way of seeking peace, a quiet moment to recharge after stressful workdays. That morning, he had probably carefully prepared his tent fishing gear and some food, excited for a weekend immersed in nature. He drove to Lake Apache completely unaware that it would be the last trip of his life. His life, with its unfinished plans and dreams, was about to be extinguished by a senseless act of violence. At the same time, there was the life of Robert Charles Comer. He had no plans, no goals. His life was a series of aimless days fueled by drugs, anger, and a long history of violence. Instead of seeking peace, he sought chaos. Instead of connecting with nature, he sought to destroy it and to destroy the innocent lives that happened to cross his path. Two parallel life paths, one of peace and one of violence, were about to intersect at a fateful point by the shore of Lake Apache. This grim contrast is at the heart of the tragedy. Larry Pritchard did nothing wrong. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there was one detail about Larry's camping trip that no one expected, a small detail that might have made him the perfect target in the eyes of the predator. It was the fact that he was alone in a secluded place, which inadvertently made him easy prey for someone like Comer. To explain the heartless cruelty of Robert Charles Comer, we must turn back time to the darkest chapters of his life. Robert Charles Comer was born on December 29, 1956, in the United States, into a family where the word happiness never existed. His parents separated when he was very young, leaving a child abandoned in a volatile world. Comer's childhood was a long series of abuse, lacking love and care. He was constantly moved from place to place with no stable home, no protective embrace. He grew up like a wild plant, unguided and untended. The darkness of abandonment enveloped Comer's young soul from his earliest days. From a young age, the signs of a deviant personality were already clear. Juvenile psychological evaluations noted Comer as an uncontrollable child with a tendency for violent outbursts and frequent disruptive antisocial behaviors. He lived as an outcast on the fringes of society, with no one to care for him and no one to trust. The accumulated loneliness and psychological trauma gradually turned him into a ticking time bomb. As he entered his teenage years, that bomb began to detonate. Comer became involved in a series of crimes, starting with petty offenses, like theft, then moving on to drug use and assault. His life was a vicious cycle of committing crimes, getting arrested, going to prison, getting out, and then offending again. Each time he was released, he had no intention of reforming or changing. On the contrary, the severity of his crimes escalated alarmingly. The next crime was always more brutal and serious than the last. Eventually, he committed sexual offenses, a turning point that showed his moral decay had hit rock bottom. According to criminal psychologists, Comer's childhood is a classic example of the pathway to violence. The absence of love coupled with abuse and neglect during his formative years created an individual incapable of empathy who disregarded social norms and laws. He never learned to resolve conflicts with words or reason. Instead, violence became the only language he knew. Here are 5 warning signs that society and the system missed in Robert Comer's case. First, cruelty to animals from a young age. Second, an uncontrollable tendency for violent outbursts. Third, a history of theft and defiance from early on. Fourth, substance abuse to cope with psychological issues. And finally, the escalation from property crimes to violent and sexual offenses. Each of these signs was a red flag that was ignored, a missed opportunity for intervention, contributing to the creation of the monster of October 3, 1987. The investigation into the Lake Apache murder proceeded with great urgency. The trail Comer left was all too clear. From the perspective of the surviving couple, that night was an endless nightmare. They recounted in terror the image of a man with soulless eyes, a gun in hand, ready to pull the trigger at any moment. They described in detail the car Comer had stolen from Larry Pritchard. Their testimony provided the police with a clear portrait of the perpetrator and the vehicle he was using to escape. From Comer's perspective, he acted coldly, instinctively. After the crime, he showed no signs of panic. He drove the stolen car, kidnapped the couple as an impulsive act, and continued his escape. He didn't think about the consequences, only acting on his brutal urges. Shortly after, an all-points bulletin was issued across Arizona with information about Robert Charles Comer and the victim's car. His capture was only a matter of time. Investigators quickly connected the clues. Tire tracks at the scene, the description from the surviving couple, and the most crucial piece of evidence, Larry Pritchard's car, all pointed in one direction. When he was arrested, Comer did not resist. He was strangely calm, a calmness that sent a shiver down the spines of even the most seasoned investigators. Throughout the interrogation, he showed no remorse or regret. His face was cold, almost emotionless, as he listened to the investigators recount the crimes he had committed. It seemed that for Comer, killing a man, raping a woman, and ruining the lives of several people was as normal as breathing. But as they gathered evidence, the investigators had not yet realized that the criminal they were hunting was not a typical fugitive. He was a man who did not fear capture, and who, even more, did not fear death. The trial of Robert Charles Comer began shortly thereafter. With a wealth of physical evidence, living witnesses, and the defendant's attitude, the case was considered a slam dunk. The prosecutor read the indictment aloud, listing the 7 serious felonies Comer faced: first-degree murder, armed robbery, kidnapping, rape, sexual assault, coercion, and unlawful use of a weapon during a felony. Each charge could have cost him the rest of his life in prison. But the focus of the trial was not on the solid evidence or the prosecutor's accusations. All attention was on the defendant. Robert Charles Comer sat there in his prison jumpsuit with a strangely nonchalant attitude. He offered no defense, no resistance, and at times even smiled cryptically at the journalists filming him. He refused to cooperate with his own court-appointed defense attorney. Legally, this was a slam-dunk case for the prosecution. They had everything they needed: the testimony of the surviving couple forensic results and the murder weapon. The question in the courtroom was no longer, is Comer guilty, but what will his sentence be? The jury, after hearing all the arguments and evidence, did not take long to reach a final verdict. In just a few hours, they returned to the courtroom with a unanimous decision: guilty on all 7 counts. And given the brutality of the crime, they recommended the highest penalty allowed by law: death. Upon hearing the 2 words, death penalty, Robert Charles Comer showed no fear or despair. He simply nodded slightly, and a faint smile reappeared on his lips. He was transferred to death row at the Florence Maximum Security Prison in Arizona, where he would spend the last years of his life awaiting his execution date. Many long years passed on death row at Florence Prison. Robert Comer's life unfolded in a cramped, repetitive, and meaningless space. Then one day, Comer did something unprecedented, an act that shook the entire Arizona judicial system. He personally wrote a motion requesting the court to halt all automatic appeals provided to death row inmates by law, and to carry out his death sentence immediately. He wanted to die. His confession and request to die were made publicly with a nonchalant and sometimes morbidly humorous attitude. He said he was tired of life in prison, and death was a release. This act immediately sparked a fierce legal and ethical debate. Human rights activists and some psychologists got involved. They argued that Robert Comer was not mentally competent to make decisions about his own life. They argued that he might be suffering from antisocial personality disorder and paranoia, and that his desire to die was actually a symptom of mental illness. According to them, executing such a person would be nothing short of state-assisted suicide. However, Robert Comer himself vehemently opposed the efforts to save his life. In competency hearings, he insisted he was completely sane and lucid. He answered the judge's questions clearly and logically. He said he fully understood the consequences of waiving his appeals. He was simply tired of a meaningless existence and wanted to end it on his own terms. What do you think? Was Robert Comer truly sane when he made this request, or was the justice system preparing to execute a mentally ill man? Participate in our community poll to share your view. The legal battle dragged on for years, but in the end, the court ruled that Robert Comer was fully competent to make his own decisions. His request was granted. The execution date was set. On May 21, 2007, 24 hours before the sentence was to be carried out, the Florence prison in Arizona entered a state of quiet special alert. Everything followed a predetermined cold and precise protocol. Staff were ordered to double-check the entire lethal injection system to ensure there were no errors. Inside death row, Robert Charles Comer, now 50 years old, was moved to the final isolation cell, also known as the Death Watch cell. The room was lit 24 hours a day with no clock, No concept of time, only waiting. Comer showed no signs of anxiety or fear. He refused a final visit from his lawyer, did not allow a chaplain to read prayers, and left no letters. He requested to be left alone. A guard later recounted, "He just sat there, staring at the wall. Sometimes he'd smirk, didn't ask the time, didn't ask what was going to happen. Almost empty." When it came time for the last meal, a privilege granted to death row inmates, Comer once again showed his defiance. By regulation, he was entitled to request a meal costing under $20. He could have chosen a burger, pizza, fried chicken, or anything within that limit. But Comer refused. He ate nothing on the evening before he died. "I don't need anything," was the only thing he said to the officer in charge. Psychologists suggest that refusing the final meal was not an act of indifference. It was a final act of control. In a system that had stripped him of all self-determination, from his freedom to his right to live, he chose to control the last thing he could, how he faced death. It was his final declaration that even in his last moments, he was still the one in control. At 1:26 p.m. on May 22, 2007, Robert Charles Comer was escorted by guards into the execution chamber. He walked calmly, without resistance, without trembling. He lay quietly on the metal gurney, allowing the staff to strap down his arms and legs. Nurses began inserting IV lines into his arms. The room was dead silent, except for the hum of machinery. Behind the glass, witnesses, including representatives of the victim's family, journalists, and prison officials, watched with bated breath. The prison warden approached and asked Comer the final regulation question: "Do you have any last words?" The entire room waited in silence for an apology, a confession of remorse, or at least an explanation. But Robert Charles Comer just looked up at the ceiling and said exactly two words completely unrelated to his crime, to his victims, or to his impending death. He said, "Go Raiders." It was a cheer for his favorite football team, the Oakland Raiders. A callous, cold, and defiant statement to the very end. That was all. No apology to Larry Pritchard's family. No mention of the couple whose lives he had destroyed. Just a cheer for a sports team, and then, at 1:42 p.m., after a cocktail of lethal drugs was injected into his veins, Robert Charles Comer's body convulsed slightly, then gradually became still. A few minutes later, a doctor entered, examined him, and declared, "Robert Charles Comer dead." A cold death, just like the life he had lived. No family came to witness. Not a single tear was shed for him. No one mourned. There was only death arriving on the schedule he had requested, and a man who had rejected society, ending his life in absolute silence, and with a joke that no one could laugh at. The death of Robert Charles Comer on May 22, 2007, officially closed the case file on the Lake Apache murder. He was the first inmate to be executed in Arizona after a 7-year hiatus. His death brought a sense of delayed justice to the family of victim Larry Pritchard and the couple who survived the nightmare. However, it also opened up countless nagging questions with no answers. Why did he do it? Was he truly remorseful or simply tired of existing? Was the sanity he displayed in court real, or was it just a sophisticated facade for a mind that was completely rotten from within? The biggest question this case leaves behind is not just about Robert Comer, but about the society that created him. Did the system fail to protect a child from abuse and neglect? Did we miss countless opportunities to intervene when the first warning signs appeared? Comer's story is a painful reminder of the importance of mental health care and early intervention for children growing up in toxic environments. A helping hand extended at the right time, a moment of proper care could have completely changed the trajectory of a life and saved innocent victims. A life that began in darkness and ended in silence has left behind a legacy of violence and an eternal question about the nature of justice, punishment, and human compassion.